first reading is taken from Isaiah chapter 53. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for any transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked, and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring, and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Psalm 90 will be read responsively. Because you have made the Lord your refuge and the Most High your habitation,
no evil will befall you, nor shall affliction come near your dwelling.
For God will give the angels charge over you, to guard you in all your ways.
Upon their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against the stone.
You will tread upon the lion, cub, and viper. You will trample down the lion and the serpent.
I will deliver those who cling to me. I will uphold them, because they know my name.
They will call me, and I will answer them. I will be with them in trouble. I will rescue and honor them.
With long life will I satisfy them, and show them my salvation.
Second reading is taken from Hebrews chapter 5. Every high priest chosen among mortals is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is subject to weakness. And because of this, he must offer sacrifice for his own sins as well as those for the people. And one does not presume to take this honor, but takes it only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but was appointed by the one who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, having been designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
of St. Mark, the 10th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Our appointed reading for today begins at verse 35, but I think it's helpful if I begin a couple of verses earlier in verse 32. So I'll have a couple of verses, and then it'll pick up with what's printed in your bulletin. So Mark 10, beginning with verse 2. Jesus and his disciples were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise again." James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Now, any parent who has dealt with a small child quickly learns to avoid this trap. "Mommy, promise me you'll do something. Daddy, can I have something?" Yet woe to the one who says yes to such questions without first asking, "What? What? What is it that you'd like me to get for you? What do you want for me to do?" Jesus, of course, is no fool. So instead of blindly saying yes to the request from James and John, he asked that all-important "what" question. And then, as I imagine it, he just shakes his head at their response. "Grant us to sit," they say eagerly, "one at your right hand and one at your left hand when you come in your glory." That is, Jesus, when you hit the big time, when you are made king, we want to be your 2 most important officials. We want to be your prime minister and chief of staff. We want to be your vice president, your secretary of state. Now, given what Jesus had just said about what lay ahead for them in Jerusalem, all about his betrayal, arrest, abuse, and death, for the 3rd time he has said this, we may be tempted also to shake our heads in disbelief and to ask, how dense could these folks be? How many times does Jesus have to spell things out for them? How many times does he have to point to the cross before they understand that his kingdom is going to be different. How many times? Yet before we get too smug, perhaps we should also consider our own struggle to truly listen to what Jesus has to say today. How do you hear what Jesus says this morning? How do we grasp that which turns our notions of greatness completely upside down? How do we deal with a Lord who intentionally becomes a servant, calling us to do the same? As we wrestle with such questions, let me draw us first to today's first reading from Isaiah. In fact, let me invite you to pick up your bulletin if you have it handy and read along with me. And while you're looking for that and getting that bulletin, let me just give you a little important background. Isaiah 53 is one of what they call servant songs, one of 4 servant songs in Isaiah. And what each of these prophecies gives us is a pointer, if you will, a signpost to the promised Messiah's life and ministry. So with that in mind, please look with me again, beginning at verse 4. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Now, as you read those words and reflect on those words and what else is in that passage, think now about Jesus and about what he's been saying along the road to Jerusalem, what he's been saying about heading to the cross. Do you see the connections between his vocation and the servant in Isaiah? Can you hear in today's words from Isaiah the calling, the ministry of Jesus as God's suffering servant? For Isaiah, you see, the crux of the matter was that God's people had refused to obey God's will. Instead of living in this covenant that God had created with them, they had walked away from this relationship with God, kind of covering it over, if you will, with a thin veneer of religion. The resulting web of sin, Isaiah says, not only had repercussions for their own lives, but for the lives of their children and their children's children. Sin has consequences. Sin, iniquity, transgressions, whatever name you use for it, must be dealt with. And yet, as Isaiah proclaims, God pulls away from any notion of detached divine retribution, that God pulls away from any notion of judgment or impersonal wrath. Instead, God gets involved. God gets involved not only in the misery and suffering brought on by his people's sin, but also in the solution to that sin. God gets involved in the healing and restoration that is needed. But quite simply, God comes down. Listen again to verse 6. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him, that is, on Jesus, the iniquity of us all. God comes down. In the person of Jesus Christ, the suffering servant, God's passionate love for us is revealed. And not just for us, for the whole world. On the cross, Jesus' surrender to God's will is so total that he takes the consequences of our sin upon himself, even though he was innocent. And what's more, on the cross, he not only frees us from the power of sin, but in the process, he turns the world's ideas of power and glory completely upside down and inside out. And it is this turning that crashes headlong into so much of what we hold near and dear. Let's face it, we understand, don't we, where James and John are coming from? We also want to be noticed, to be on top, to be in charge. We want to be important, even great, right? And that's nothing new. We also hear that when the other 10 heard about James and John's power play, they became angry, maybe because they didn't think of it first. And so once again, Jesus calls them together for a lesson that seems like it needs often to be repeated. You know how the world works, he says to them. You know how those on top throw their weight around and how people, when they get just a little bit of power, it goes to their heads. But that is not how it's going to be among those who follow me. That is not what being great looks like in God's family. Whoever truly wishes to become great must become a servant to others. And whoever wants to be on top in my kingdom must take their place at the bottom. Jesus, you see, has a different definition of greatness. Yet how do we make this understanding of greatness concrete, practical in our lives? What might our being a servant actually look like? Well, one place we can turn for guidance is to our own Lutheran tradition and Martin Luther's small catechism. I'm beginning confirmation class today, so I guess the catechism is on my mind. But it's a great source for us. So, as an example of how we might turn this idea of servanthood into something practical, Luther, in explaining the Ten Commandments, speaks about our Christian duty, our obligation to love our neighbors. It's not enough, Luther says, to simply refrain from murdering them or hurting them. It's not enough to refrain from that. Instead, we must actively help and support our neighbors in all of life's needs. Now think about that. What does that say about our response to those who are in need, those who are hungry, those who are routinely and systematically excluded from the table? Likewise, Luther teaches that it's simply not enough to refrain from stealing, right? It's not enough to just refrain from stealing or cheating others, but we are actually called to help them improve and protect their means for making a living. So in terms of our own occupations and work and our own interactions with people, what does this mean for us in terms of our attention to being honest? Especially in the way we go about our jobs. How and where we use our resources and our money, or how we treat the property of others. And finally, Luther says it's not enough to simply refrain from lies, betrayals, and selective truths about others, as hard as that might be. It's not enough to simply refrain from that, but instead we are to come to others' defense, speak well of them, interpret everything they do in the best possible light. That one always gets me. Interpret everything they do in the best possible light. I was driving down the interstate yesterday, and I tell you, it was very hard for me to interpret everything everybody was doing in the best possible light, and that's just one small glimmer into my heart. It's hard. Especially in our current climate, where viewpoints have become so polarized, and in which treating those who disagree with us as stupid or unpatriotic or un-American or even as the enemy has become pretty much standard fare. And yet, what an act of service it is to treat another person with honesty and respect, even if we happen to disagree. What an act of love it is to listen to another person, to give them, as Luther says, the benefit of the doubt, to seek to understand, to speak truthfully, even if it doesn't help our cause. Again, these are just a few examples of how we can live out Jesus' call as servants. How we can live out what he calls true greatness. And doubtless, if you were to take a few moments to think about all the people that you interact with on a daily basis, you could probably think of many more opportunities to serve those around you. And here's the truth as I see it. If we as people of God were to intentionally invest ourselves in just a few such endeavors with even modest seriousness, if we had enough faith and love to hold ourselves and one another accountable to this kind of greatness that Jesus talks about, why, it would be transformative. Not only of our own lives, but for the lives of those around us. Whoever wants to be great among you must become a servant, Jesus says. And whoever wants to be first among you must become slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Amen.